Hey everybody, it's Henry W. Steele, and this is the apocalypse of the Tokyo J-1. Now, I did a video previously on the Tokyo J-1, and really I dug into this part of the story right here, more so than anything else. And then just a little bit over here. And in this video, I'm pretty much just going to skim over this part of the story, and we're going to look at this a little bit more in more detail. And I think some of the in quote hints that you will receive from watching this video will be helpful to you in figuring things out a little bit more quickly, hopefully. But before I get to this, I need to talk about something else really quickly. And don't worry, when I say apocalypse, what I mean by apocalypse is the actual definition of the word. I'm not talking about the end of the world or anything like that. I'm just talking about what the word means, which is the unveiling or the revelation. But now to the thing I was going to talk about, and that is coordinate systems. When we look at the planets, whether we're looking for astronomical reasons or astrological reasons or any reasons at all, we need to realize that there are actually two main coordinate systems that are used. The first one, let me click over here so we can look. The first one is the ecliptic system, and that's based on a relationship between the Earth and the Sun. And the second is the equatorial system, which is really based on the Earth's equator. So basically with the ecliptic system, what we have here is a big flat plane drawn out from the Sun to the Earth. And then we measure the longitude in degrees around the Sun that the Earth travels, and we measure the latitude, which is the number of degrees above and below the Earth's and the Sun's joined plane. So if we look at astrolog again, this is the ecliptic coordinate system right here, and we see that we have all the different planets in the longitude degrees around the zodiac right there, and we have the latitude right here in degrees. And you'll notice that the latitude is just a degree or two most of the time. The moon has a little bit more latitude than the other planets, but they're all within just a few degrees of each other. Okay, all the planets, because the Earth actually does move up and down compared to if we base this system on a different planet, but since we live on Earth, we base it on our relationship with Earth and the Sun, and all the other planets are compared to that relationship. So these latitude numbers right here are the other planets, how many degrees above or below that plane that's created by the relationship between the Earth and the Sun. So, and we never get more than a few degrees above or below it. Now, if we go back to the equatorial coordinate system, that's just based on the Earth. That's based on the Earth's equator. Now, I'm sure most of you realize that the Earth's tilted 23.4 degrees approximately, so that the Earth's equator does not go out evenly into space relative to the position of the Sun and the Earth. So, excuse me. The relationship that we get here, we actually measure the equatorial system with right ascension. We don't use degrees of longitude, we use hours of right ascension or hours of angle. And that actually looks like this. You can go into settings, go to calculation settings, and instead of, I have it set here on 360 degrees, so that's why we see the 0 degree is right here in the beginning of Aries, and 360th degree is right there also. But if we go to the hours and minutes setting, we get what, we actually have to also go to calculation settings and click on equatorial position, so that changes the coordinate system, and it gives us ever so slightly different positions for the planets, because we're looking from the Earth's equator plane that goes out into space. And we'll see here that we now have, where the latitude used to be, we have declination, because in the equatorial coordinate system, we have declination instead of latitude, and we have right ascension instead of degrees of longitude. So it's actually measured like this in hours and minutes around where the longitude, or the longitude is. And then we have degrees of declination for the what used to be latitude, it's now declination. Now the thing is that this declination number for these planets are based on the tilt of the Earth. So what happens is Earth's tilt is 23.4 degrees approximately, and at the different points in time, let me restrict everything here, and we'll use the sun because we're most familiar with that. When the sun's right here, we're at 0 degrees declination. I'll go forward in time here. We see we get to be 0 degrees declination because the sun's right at the equator as far as we're concerned. So it matches up with the celestial plane, basically, that we get in the ecliptic system. And then as the sun moves through the zodiac here, we actually see it rise in declination to the point where it's at maximum declination right here between Gemini and Cancer. And then it goes down in declination all the way to between Sagittarius and Capricorn right here. Now the thing is, because this coordinate system is based on the Earth, all of the planets, if I turn like Venus and Mercury back on just as an example, all of the planets, their declination is going to be very close to the sun's declination. Now what that means is anytime any planet is around here in the zodiac, Gemini, Cancer, it's going to be very close, if not at maximum declination. Also, it will be at minimum declination in these two signs, one of these two signs, Sagittarius or Capricorn. It'll be at 0 degrees declination in one of these signs and one of these signs. And you will sometimes see, it won't be perfect because what's happening is the sun will be exactly the 23.4 degrees approximately that we get because of the tilt of the Earth. But the planets, because their latitude is a few degrees above or below Earth, that calculation, actually, that number gets added to the declination. So if we look here, we'll use Venus as an example. I'll go forward a few days. Right here, where it would be at maximum declination, we see Venus is at 23.23. If I go back to turn that off, we see that Venus is actually right at its 0 degrees latitude right there. So it's very, very close to perfect relative to what the tilt of the Earth is, because we don't really add, we're just adding 3 minutes of latitude right there. So it's very, very close. But if I take, let's use Mercury here as an example, we see Mercury has plus 2 degrees of latitude right here. And if we go back and turn the equatorial system on, we'll see that Mercury has 25.5 degrees, or 25 degrees, 30 minutes approximately, of declination. And that's more than the maximum 23, almost 23 1/3 degrees that you get from the tilt of the sun. And that's because you're at the maximum 23.4 degrees declination here. But you add to that those 2 degrees from the latitude, and that's why you have this number bigger than the 23 degrees. So that can happen for any of the planets other than the sun. And that's referred to as being out of bounds astrologically, is what they call that. Anytime a planet is out of bounds, it's at a number of degrees in declination that's greater than the maximum number of degrees that the sun can be at. So a planet can only be out of bounds right around here, because it has to be at very close to maximum declination, and you can be out of bounds by being lower than the minimum declination also. But excuse me, this only happens right around here. So if you hear about a planet being out of bounds, this is only going to happen in these two signs right here. So now you can understand why a sign like Cancer or Gemini seems to be so important, more important than other things, because there's a lot of things declinationally speaking that only happen in these two. Like maximum declination only happens here for all planets. Minimum only happens here for all planets. If you're going out of bounds, it's going to happen here or here, okay? So keep that in mind. It's important to understand the difference between these coordinate systems. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that also, but we're going to look at that math in just a little bit. Okay, I had to stop the video there for a second and drink some water. All right, so let's look at this. Normally, if we're using the ecliptic system, that would be turned off, and we would be using the zodiac position, and it would look like this: 14 degrees Gemini, 14 degrees, 9 minutes Gemini. So what's happening is we actually have 60 minutes for every degree here in Gemini, or for anywhere in the zodiac actually. And those are considered minutes of arc. Since there's 360 degrees in a circle, you multiply that by 60 and you get 21,600 minutes of arc in the 360 degrees. So if that number ever shows up somewhere in calculations that you're making based on something, you now understand why that particular number or something very close to this would be important. Now we're going to go a little bit further than that. We're going to look back here, and this is what we normally look like. I mean, we're at the sign, the number, we look at the sign, we look at the number of degrees in the sign, and then the number of minutes of that degree in the sign. Normally, I like to have it set at 360 degrees so that I can base everything on the total zodiac and not just the sign. But it's important to realize that there's the 21,600 minutes of arc in a circle. Okay, so when we go to the equatorial system, it should have the hours and minutes on it. That's actually the proper way to look at it. And the actual number of hours and minutes, there are 60 minutes for every hour, and there's 24 hours in that circle. So 60 times 24 is 1,440. So, I mean, we all pretty much know that 144 is extremely important. It's 12 times 12. Well, 1,440 is extremely important because it's the number of minutes in 24 hours. So that's a day, but it's also, when we use the equatorial system, it's also the number of minutes in a circle. Okay, so let's keep that in mind when we look at things. All right, so one last thing I want to show you is we're looking at all these hours and minutes and degrees and minutes of arc and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to go ahead and set this back like I like it. There we go. The number of minutes in a year is 525,600. And you might ask yourself, why is that important? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out, right? There's 365 days in a year. You multiply that by the 24 hours in a day. Then you multiply that by the 60 minutes an hour. And of course, we're not using the fraction. That's the number of minutes in a calendar day that is not a leap year. So the question is, why is this important? So let's go back to the Tunnel Through the Air here on page 287 and look at the three numbers that Gann gives us in relationship to the Tokyo J-1. He gives us 600 feet long, 25 bombing planes, and 100 officers. Now, here's the thing. We all know that this adds up to 725. And we all know that all the officers died except for 2, so we subtract 2. And we all know that all the planes were destroyed except for 3, so we subtract 3 and we get 720. The 720 was used to represent 2 complete iterations of a circle or cycle when we were looking at this in the last video. If you didn't watch that video, I'll put a link up to it. I'll try and get it over here in the corner. And watch that because it's really good and explains in detail what I'm going to be going over very quickly over here. If you've already watched it, then you already know what I'm talking about. But that 725, if we square that, is 525,625. In other words, it's the number of minutes in a year. Okay, so I mean, obviously it's off by 25 minutes there, but that's pretty darn close. And this is actually something that's a little bit important. Those numbers point to the time period of 1 year. Okay, so keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and look at this again. We know on the morning of August 3rd, Captain Robert Gordon traveled across Arizona and New Mexico, and as he neared El Paso, he saw the largest airship that he had ever seen before slowly drifting over El Paso. It was a giant plane, and Robert knew that it was either a mothership or one of the enemy's great bombing planes, which had been so high that he had never seen it, or never been able to see it before. He began circling at a great distance, watching to see what this monster of the air was going to do. Finally, it slowed down and came to a complete standstill. He saw that it could anchor in the air and knew that the enemy had another discovery that would beat what the Americans had. Waiting for a while, he saw what seemed to be an observation platform emerge from the side of the plane. An officer appeared on it with some instruments. Captain Gordon thought that they were either taking photographs or making observations over El Paso for some purpose. Fortunately, he had started out on a bombing plane and had plenty of bombs on board. He decided that he had but one life to give for his country and that he would raise as high as he could, sail swiftly over this monster, and drop his bombs. When he got as close over as he could gauge, he released the automatic control and started dropping bombs one after another. The first bomb made a hit and struck the ship near the middle, which was lucky, tearing a terrific hole in it. He knew from the way that it acted that it was badly disabled. Now was the time to get in his effective work. Dropping lower, he let go more bombs, this time striking the giant ship from both in the front and the rear. It started to fall rapidly, and he followed it down and got close enough to see that there were still men on board alive, so he let go more bombs, and in a few minutes there was nothing but a wreck of the greatest dreadnought of death which had ever floated over American soil. Before venturing to land, Captain Gordon ascended to a great height, circled the sky to see if there were any more enemy ships in sight which might endanger his life. Finding the air clear, he immediately radioed the news with his pocket radio to Captain Kenilworth, who was stationed in San Diego. The news was quickly flashed to General Pearson's headquarters. On examination, they found that the giant ship was a mothership more than 600 feet long, bearing the name Tokyo J-1. And then it carried 25 bombing planes of the most modern type with collapsible wings equipped with powerful searchlights carrying bombs and poisonous gases. It was estimated that more than 100 officers and aviators were on board the airship when it fell. All were killed but two. They were badly wounded with broken limbs and were taken prisoners. There were found to be 3 of the enemy's planes that were not badly damaged. And then it goes on and on a little bit. But the important part that we're going to look at, I just went over. So I talked about this in the last one, and it became very obvious that if Robert Gordon actually accomplished all this on August 3rd, like the story said, that it couldn't actually be anything astrological. If it was astrological, then this had to be describing something that took place over quite a period of time. So I'm going to actually, you know what, let me go ahead and close that and just open it back up. I'm going to go backwards in time to 1930. And we're going to look at August 3rd. Now, it did say that it was in the morning, so we'll go back to 10:30 is fine. It doesn't have to be precise. So what we discovered the previous video is that if this description is accurate, then we're talking about Jupiter, the planet Jupiter. Okay? So I mean, it says that it was the biggest one he had ever seen, and it also said that it was the wreck of the greatest dreadnought of death which had ever floated over American soil. Now, if you think about that for a second, that is a very dramatic description of a plane here that had a very small part, or at least it seemed like it had a very small part in this story. It's just a few pages, and it's mentioned a couple more times, 2, 3, 4 more times later in the book. But as we're going to find out, the Tokyo J-1 is actually very important to the war. Or at least, kind of. Well, you'll see what I mean. Now, we see that on August 3rd, Jupiter was at a certain place right here, and we see that it was below 0 degrees longitude, or latitude rather, I'm sorry. And it was moving towards its north node. Now, we also know that El Paso's full name is really El Paso del Norte, which is Spanish, or a really bad English accent for Spanish for the passageway to the north. So we find that in this particular year, if we go forward in time, Jupiter moves, and then it slows down, and then it stops. And it stops, if you look at it right here, it stops right by its north node. Its north node is at it's right around 110 degrees geocentrically, this particular orbit of Jupiter. Because geocentrically, Jupiter's north node changes a little bit. Heliocentrically, its north node is always at about 100 degrees of the zodiac. But this year, the north node, or it's Jupiter's north node, was at about 110 degrees. Okay, so this right here is what's being described in this story as far as the Tokyo J-1 goes, because Jupiter stopped right on its north node, just like the Tokyo J-1 stopped above El Paso. And then, excuse me, they have the air fight. Well, the air fight actually happens during this period of time. And we see here the only part that doesn't really fit in at this point is the fact that after Robert damaged the ship, it started to fall rapidly, and he followed it down. If we watch Jupiter here, watch its latitude. As I go forward in time, Jupiter's latitude is just going up. It's increasing. Even before that part, back in anything after August 3rd, which is the date we're given in the story, Jupiter's latitude is just increasing. So we actually have to change the calculation settings to the equatorial position so that our coordinate system shows us declination. Now watch Jupiter's declination here. Of course, we know that Jupiter's declination is going to be very close to maximum declination because it's in one of these two signs right here, right by the summer solstice point, or the 90-degree point of the zodiac. And as we go forward, its declination drops. Okay, it goes forward a little bit as it goes retrograde, or it increases a little bit as it goes retrograde due to the fact that it's moving closer to maximum declination point right there. But then after it goes direct again, it drops, and it just drops, and it drops, and it drops, and it continues to drop until the end of the war. So let me go back here, 1930. So let's get back here where Jupiter goes retrograde. There it's stationary. And we see that the moon right here is the only thing, planetarily speaking, that can be following what's being described here of Robert Gordon doing. In other words, he goes up, he goes down, he dives, he raises to great heights, all that kind of stuff. The moon does that in declination or latitude. And we find that if we go back, let's see, take the equatorial system off. If we go back, so we just see the latitude right here, we see that the moon's maximum latitude, let's see, it's 5.2, It's 5.0, 5.2, 5.0 again. Its maximum latitude is right there while it's conjunct Jupiter. So that would seem to indicate that the bombing planes or the bombs and so forth are in relationship to the moon in some way. That might be something you want to kind of look at. Okay. Now, if we go, I can actually pull up. Whoops, that is not what I wanted to pull up. There we go. This is the PDF of the Tunnel Thru the Air, and I use this to search the number of instances of words. And if we look up bomb, and I did a search so that the whole words were not used. Basically, that means that we find any word that has the word bomb in it. So it could be bomb, bombed, bombing, bombs, all that kind of stuff. So we do that and we find that there are 53 instances of bombs, bombs, bombed, so forth and so on. And if we scroll all the way down, we find that the last one is Bombay, India. So this one right here doesn't count. Everything else is bomb, bombs, bombing, bombed, or bombardment. Okay, so there are 52 instances of the different types of the word bomb in this book. So that's something to pay attention to. And there are 3 instances of the word of bombardment, or the different iterations of that. So that leaves 49 instances of the word bomb, bombs, bombed, or bombing. I'm just going to let you know that's important. So thought I would let you know that. Now let's go ahead and look at this really quickly. We're going to ignore the pocket radio and this stuff right here. And we're just going to look at these numbers again. The Tokyo J-1. Now, if we look at, come on, I think my mouse battery's running out. It's getting a little finicky here. If we look at the Tokyo J-1, add up 2, 6, 2, 7, 6. Tokyo is 23. J is 24. And the 1 equals 25. So the title, Tokyo J-1, numerologically adds up to 25, which just happens to be the same number of bombing planes on board. Pretty interesting. Now, one thing I want to point out is the name Tokyo J-1, or it could be Tokyo J-1, right? If we look at Gann's, let's see, there we go. Gann's 1929 annual forecast, we see the Gann forecast. This is projected curve number 1, the main trend which the 30 industrial stocks should follow, or basically the Dow Jones should follow, or the Dow Jones Industrial Average should come close to this, is what Gann was expecting at the beginning, or at the end of 1928 when he released this. He expected the high to be on August 7th or 8th. Now, the September 3rd high right here that he has marked on here was the actual high of the market and moved down from there. But he was originally anticipating that the highest high of the year would be at this point in August, which is 360 days before August 3rd, 1930. So that's just something to think about right there. It's an interesting concept, huh? Because it's the number, obviously 360 is important, but it comes before that date. Now, also pay attention to the fact that Gann has the larger swings marked here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, so forth. But anyway, so that's something to pay attention to and think about. Okay, getting back actually to the Tokyo J-1. It's described here dramatically as the biggest, the greatest dreadnought of death which had ever floated over American soil. So this is something that's really big and really important. And it's described as a mothership more than 600 feet long, bearing the name Tokyo J-1, carrying 25 bombing planes of the most modern type, blah, 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 and more than 100 officers on board. All were killed but 2. So we have those numbers there, which we used to get to 725 earlier. But if we consider the fact that when he's talking about bombing planes, he might just be talking about the moon, and we know that there's 25 bombing planes on board and 22 of them were destroyed, we could take the number 22, which we know is important, and multiply that by the lunar orbital period of 27.32. That turns out to be 601 days, which is more than 600. Okay, so if we add, here's August 3rd, 1930, and we add 601 days to it, we get March 26, 1932, which doesn't seem that important at this point in time. But if we come back here and realize that November 11th, 1930 is the date that is most representative of what was described in this part of the story of the actual giant monster of the air coming to a standstill, and then Captain Gordon flying to a great height, dropping bombs, so forth. We see that this is November 11th, 1930 that this happens. And if we change this date to November 11th, 1930, and then we add 601 days or 22 lunar orbital periods, we find that we land on July 4th, 1932. Now that seems to be pretty important. Now, there was 2 planes that Robert Gordon and Walter Kenilworth used and that were eventually destroyed. They lost those planes, but then a 3rd plane was shipped off somewhere so they could look at it and see how it worked. So if we add those 2 other planes that were destroyed, add plus 2732, that's 1, plus 2732, we get a total of 656 days. 656. That would take us to August 28th, 1932, which is 2 days before the book ends, or before they were reunited. And that's extraordinarily close. It's not the exact date of August 30th, and the reason for that is because the lunar orbital cycle, 70 lunar orbital cycles had to happen between the time Marie disappeared and reappeared, which was at a slightly different position for the moon. So I won't go into detail about that because this video is already very long. But anyway, so we see that the number of bombing planes is directly correlated to the number of lunar orbital periods, 2 very important things that happen in this book. Very important things. Now, it's also very interesting that if we take, subtract 98 days, we get to August 5th. So if we subtract 100 days, we get to August 3rd. Now, everyone thinks 100 minus 2 people that were still alive gives us 98, which is a reasonable assumption. But let's not forget the fact that the book actually says, just like it's more than 600 feet long, that there were more than 100 officers. So we use the number 100, and it's actually descriptive of the number of days between August 3rd and the point in time where the moon was conjunct Jupiter when it went when it went to retrograde motion and stand still in the air. It took a couple more days for the moon to become conjunct with Jupiter right then. So these numbers right here for the Tokyo J-1 are very descriptive of what's happening here. We've got the 100 telling us how many days it was from this date to the actual occurrence of astrologically what was happening. We have the number of bombing planes indicating the number of orbits of the moon to the effect. In other words, we had a cause over here, and we had the effect at the end of the war, which was the end of the war. So now, one thing I want to point out is, let me go ahead and pull the calculator up again. When we add August 3rd, 1930, our 725 number, to this, we come to July 28th, 1932. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this video here because we're already over 35 minutes long, so I'm sure you're probably a bit tired of listening to me at this point. But anyway, I hope this gives you an inclination into some things that are going on here. And of course, we don't know if what I just showed you guys is actually accurate or what Gann was really doing, but it seems like it kind of would be pretty close to possible, right? But it will give you an avenue to look through this book with a slightly different angle, I guess you could say, if you haven't already done something very similar to it. Anyway, so until next time, this is hwsteele, and I will talk to you later.